This is Jilliana Ranicar-Breese in part 2 of my interview with John and Rose. Now, John, tell me about pre-Rose life.
Pre-Rose life. Okay, so pre-Rose life is about 55 years.
Right.
Pre-Rose life.
Okay.
So I was born in the northeast of England to a working class family that made good. So my father was in port management. We moved around a lot when I was a child. I was the first person of my family to go to university. My parents were delighted about this. I studied philosophy at Southampton University, and they had high hopes on me, high expectations, and I met them. I ended up working corporately. I was a systems engineer. I worked for IBM in London.
9 to 5.
Back in 9 to 5. Well, no, actually, it was probably 9 till 10 at night. It was a good 13-hour day with bonuses. I became the firm's man. It was corporate identity stuff.
Oh yes.
And at first it was quite a challenge, and it was the emergent kind of arena of expanding IT and stuff back in 1980. People were having orgasms kind of because you could get 8 megabytes inside something the size of a couple of walk-in wardrobes. Them were the days. I guess what you're using to film me with there is kind of exceeds that by 100-fold, and you can put it in the palm of your hand. But back then, it was an emergent technology. It was quite exciting. I worked very hard. I did very well for myself. My parents were delighted. And gradually it dawned on me that all I was really doing was I was living out their expectations. So they were working class, made good. So making good, it meant,
What was the turning point?
What was the turning point?
You met someone?
Well, no, it wasn't that. No, I'll tell you what the turning point was, actually. The turning point was that I had a desk, and I had one of those, those little Toblerone-shaped things that they put on the desk. It's made of cardboard, and it says, think, IBM. And I got fed up one day of just having this bloody thing on my desk.
You wanted to think John.
So I wanted to think John, not IBM.
Yeah.
So I remember I kind of put my hand like this. It was a bit gingerly. I just slid it into the bin. Yeah. And about half an hour later, I went out to get a cup of coffee from the vending machine. And I came back, and the think IBM was magically back on my desk.
Oh, control.
And I thought, so I kind of looked around at people, and people were looking at me, and I was looking at the people. And I thought, nobody's going to tell me that they actually decided to tell me that I should think IBM rather than John. And that was the beginning of the end for me, really.
Interesting.
That was the beginning of the end.
How much longer after did you stay?
I stayed on. I was there for another 2 or 3 months before I handed in my notice.
But did you have another job? Did you know what you were going to do?
No idea. No, I've
Did you go travelling?
I've always been that way. Eventually, yeah. What they did was they took me to. They said, perhaps you need something a bit more exciting to kind of keep you going, keep you in the game. So they put me on the Tesco IBM project. So I was a system tester for all of the stuff. Excuse me, for the electronic point of sale machines that they now use in Tesco. So they stuck me in a Quonset hut with half a dozen geniuses who were doing all the coding. And I had a great time there, and I worked there for 7 months, and they gave me a handsome bonus. And they said, do you want to stay now? And I said, no. And I quit on the Friday, and by the Monday morning I was in Amsterdam playing pinball and taking too many drugs and enjoying my life,
So you travelled the road less travelled into the unknown.
Absolutely, yeah.
What year was that?
That was 1982.
So it was the 80s, right.
It was the 1980s.
So computers hadn't taken over the world. I mean, mobile phones hadn't taken over the world.
No. This was IBM pre-Microsoft,
Yeah.
It was all fairly corporate stuff. Anyway, so I travelled around for a bit. I wound up in York.
How long did you spend in Amsterdam?
I don't know, a few months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I travelled. I kind of went got as far as Spain. I was thinking about going to India. It's a long story. My father had his lung out. He contracted a DVT whilst flying, and an embolism sort of lodged itself in his lungs. So I'm an only child. I went back to help him, because like my mother really needed the support.
Sure.
So I went back, but I eventually found myself in York, and it was a long and invidious process, but I just found myself eventually sitting on the bank of the River Ouse, watching the river for increasingly long periods of time every day. And as I sat there, my mind just gradually emptied, and I experienced a kind of like a dropping into a much vaster appreciation of the world that I lived in. And it was like kind of coming out of an attic and finding you lived in a mansion, you know. And
so it was a kind of meditation, wasn't it?
Yeah, well,
Had you already embraced meditation?
No, not at all. I mean, in my teenage years, I read tarot. I read Alan Watts.
Uh-huh.
You know, I loved taking mind-expanding drugs. Took a lot of them as a teenager, and then kind of like all of that really got buried when I discovered the rationality of philosophy. So philosophy taught me how to think, and computing taught me how to apply that thinking to make a living out of it, you know. And then this kind of like opened me up to a completely different realm. And I was an occupational therapy student at the time. I'd taken up an occupational therapy course in York, and I remember walking into the principal's office and saying, "Do you know, I've got to tell you now, I've just had this understanding that we are all multidimensional beings and the world is much larger than we imagine." And she said, "Are you on drugs?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Have you ever taken drugs?" I said, "Yeah, but like, you know, years ago." And she just wrote me off as an acid casualty and said, "Go away for a year and then come back to us." So I went away forever, basically. I was living in a converted cattle barn at the time, just outside York. It was freezing cold, and I discovered yoga. I went into the library. I was actually, a voice in my head told me to go into the library, pick up the book that was waiting for me. I had no idea what that was. So I go into the library, and I mean, I'm not an airy-fairy New Ager person. This voice was as real to me as your voice is now.
Wow.
Jilliana, you know.
Whose voice was it?
I don't know. It
wasn't your voice?
No, it was, and the interesting thing was it was neither a male nor a female voice. It was an ambivalent voice.
Kind of like an angel.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? I mean, we could label, but I'm only going by my experience. That's all I've ever gone by.
Yeah.
I'm not very big on doctrine or credo, but I am big on experience.
So what was the book?
The book was Richard Hiddleman's 28-day yoga plan. It dropped on my foot because it's kind of like an elongated book. And it was kind of sticking out in the Dewey classification of it all. It's about 653.
So it was a sign.
And I touched the book and it dropped on my foot, and there it is. So I take the book and I take it home, and it's got the beautiful green goddess doing all the yoga stretching, you know, lovely pictures of her. And I thought, I want to do this.
I've seen the books on the green goddess, yes.
I could hardly touch my knees, let alone get my hands on the floor. But I spent 2 hours a day stretching, and then I spent an hour a day meditating. And
You didn't go to classes? Workshops?
It took me another 2 months before I could muster the wherewithal, the courage really to go. It was before yoga got big. Yoga really started getting big in the UK in about 1990. This was 1983. Yoga was village halls. You changed in the toilets. You know, it's freezing cold. It was mostly women, middle-aged, middle-class women in leotards, and me. You know, my hair halfway down my back. In rat's ass. So I was kind of quite popular because I was a bit of a kind of misfitted like young hippie man, and I went along to 3 or 4 classes a week. And then I found my real teacher, my first real teacher, back in 1988, and became a personal pupil. Her name was Di Kendall.
Right. Well, we'll continue this in part 3, and I look forward to it. Thank you very much, John.
Fab, you're welcome.